Story 1. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It was just attention. Just excitement I thought I was missing. Marriage had been 9 years. No kids, no scandals, just routine. I believed the story I was telling myself. I'm only human. Everyone needs a little distraction sometimes. The truth, as I would learn, is that the line between human error and selfishness is thinner than you think. At first, the signs were almost imperceptible. The phone always facing down. Her laughter a little too sharp at times. Late walk, she said. Just to clear my head. She never explained why she came home smelling of perfume she didn't usually wear. Or why her hair was suddenly styled before work, though she claimed she didn't have time for that. I told myself it was paranoia. I wanted to believe the person I married was still here. Some nights I would catch a glimpse of her eyes, wary, distracted, hiding something. It gnawed at me, asked subtle questions, casually during dinner. Everything okay at work? I would ask. She would smile and nod, but the way she smiled didn't reach her eyes. It was a practice smile, one that said, I've heard this all before, and you'll never know. Then came the small lies. She said she stayed late at the office, but a friend called me, mentioning they had left hours before. She said she was meeting a client, but I noticed the same car parked outside her cafe stop multiple nights in a row. Each lie was tiny, almost inconsequential, and yet they added up, quietly building a wall between us, a wall I couldn't tear down. I began keeping track. A private log on my laptop, screenshots of messages, dates, times, notes about her schedule. At night I would sit quietly in the living room with the lights dimmed, a cup of tea in hand, and write what I saw, what I felt. I didn't tell anyone, not a friend, not a family member. It was my own way of making sense of the chaos, a journal of a husband who felt powerless, yet strangely in control. Some evenings, I would recall our early days. Our first apartment, the smell of fresh paint and coffee. Our walks in the park, laughter echoing on empty sidewalks. I remembered the nights we stayed up, talking about nothing and everything. Those memories made the present sting even more. I hated the contrast, the loving past, the distant present. The real turning point came by accident. I was doing the dishes one night. Kitchen was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint drip from the faucet filling the room. Her tablet sat carelessly on the counter. A notification popped up. Last night was worth the wait. I froze. My hands remained in the warm water, suds running over my fingers. I didn't open it. I didn't scroll. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, listening, feeling the room shrink around me as if the air itself had turned cold. This was the moment I had choices. Confront, deny, walk away. I chose none of those. Instead, I watched. Quietly. Observing every pattern, noticing every slip. Taking note of dates, times, messages. I created a private record. Screenshots backed up somewhere she wouldn't find them. Journals of behavior patterns, tiny details I would have otherwise ignored. I started writing what I saw in a notebook at night, not as revenge, not as a plan, but as a way to process, to understand, to ground myself. I stopped asking questions, stopped pushing for connection. Stopped acting like a husband desperate to save a marriage she no longer wanted. What surprised me most was how calm I became. The calmer I got, the more she noticed. Cheaters crave control, and control was gone. Days blended into weeks. I watched her in subtle ways, the way she checked her phone, the slight tension in her shoulders, the conversations she held when she thought I wasn't listening. I didn't judge. I didn't scream. I merely observed. And slowly, the anger inside me shifted into something I didn't expect. Clarity. For weeks, I stayed calm. I didn't confront. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Didn't even allow myself to daydream about revenge. Instead, I prepared. I consulted a lawyer, organized finances, planned a clean exit, silently mapping out the steps I would take the moment she decided to leave. I reflected often on what I had lost and what I was about to lose. The memories, once sweet, now tasted bitter. I thought of our first apartment, our vacations, the nights we stayed up talking about the future. And yet I also noticed the cracks, the small, unnoticed habits that hinted this might not have lasted forever, even if no one had cheated. She became increasingly unsettled by my lack of reaction. She tried subtle manipulations, compliments, little gifts, feigned innocence. I responded with nothing. Silence became its own kind of response, sharper than any confrontation could have been. I remember one evening in particular. She walked into the living room, smiling nervously, as if rehearsing the words she was about to say. I was reading on the couch, my notebook beside me. She paused. I looked up. She asked almost casually, "Are we okay?" I smiled faintly.
I think so.
No anger, no accusation, just calm, the kind of calm that makes people uncomfortable. She left the room, fuming silently. I returned to my notebook. I thought about how she might have sensed the distance growing between us, about the small ways a person adapts to betrayal, about the quiet, subtle shifts that make all the difference. And I realized my revenge wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was stillness. It was the quiet assertion of myself, the slow reclaiming of my life. 2 months later, she told me she needed space. I said I understood. Within a week, she moved out. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She just left. I watched her pack her things with a strange detachment, neither happy nor sad. I didn't speak. I didn't interfere. I merely observed. When the divorce papers arrived at her apartment, she called, panicked, angry, confused. She asked how long I had known. I said the truth. Long enough. I could hear her inhale sharply on the other end, the weight of realization settling in. She tried to argue, to plead, to explain. I listened quietly. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue back. I waited. The affair didn't last. The man she left me for wanted excitement, not responsibility. She tried to come back. Said no. The revenge wasn't what I did to her. It was what I didn't do. I didn't yell. I didn't confront. I didn't beg or threaten. I didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she had hurt me. I walked away with dignity, stability, a future intact. Sometimes I imagine she tells people the story differently. I imagine she leaves out the calm, the quiet planning. It's the way she realized too late that she had lost more than she ever expected. And that, in itself, is the quietest kind of revenge, the kind you don't announce. Sometimes the quietest choices have the loudest impact. Story 2. I had worked at the company for nearly 3 years when I realized how completely our HR officer controlled everything. Schedules, approvals, even the way people spoke in meetings. No one challenged them, not because they were untouchable, but because everyone was scared of the paperwork, the reprimands, the endless forms. At first, I tried to ignore it, followed the rules, did my job, kept my head down. I smiled at HR in the hallway, nodded politely, and thought that if I didn't make waves, maybe I'd be left alone. But over time, their control seeped into every corner of the office. Every small decision, every interaction was scrutinized. Nothing was ever just work. Everything became a potential trap. It started with small things. Deadlines were moved without notice. A simple time-off request could turn into a 10-step approval process. Someone forgot to file a form, and suddenly, they were in HR's office, explaining themselves. Even my own tasks became suffocating, because I never knew what would be questioned next. The constant tension started to wear on me, on everyone. I tried complaining to my manager, politely, calmly. "I'm concerned about the bureaucracy," I said. "It's slowing us down." My manager nodded, but nothing changed. HR had the system and the rules were rigid. There was no room for negotiation. Then one day, I realized something. HR loved rules more than people. They craved control more than fairness. They thrived on obedience. And I had been giving them exactly what they wanted, my compliance. So I stopped, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in quiet strategy. I followed every rule, every single one. I meticulously documented my work. Every task completed, every email sent, every meeting attended. I created a private folder with screenshots, copies of forms, notes about every interaction. It was slow, tedious work, but it gave me something HR could not take: control over my own narrative. At first, it was almost invisible. HR continued to micromanage, to check, to question. But now, I had evidence. Every decision, every request, every mistake they accused me of, I could show exactly what had happened, and I kept it all quiet. I didn't tell anyone, not my manager, not my colleagues. It was a silent shield. I started observing more. I watched how HR behaved with others, noting patterns. Who they favored, who they scrutinized, who they ignored. I noticed how they reacted when someone dared to ask a question outside the process. Subtle intimidation, cold smiles, pointed pauses. Every small move was cataloged in my mind and in my files. At the same time, I made no mistakes. I was the perfect employee. I followed the rules, yes, but I also documented everything with precision. Every email was saved. Every form correctly filed. Every deadline met. If HR wanted to find fault, there was none to be found. And yet I was ready. Weeks passed. HR continued their reign of quiet terror, unaware that I had been quietly preparing for something bigger. I kept records of every petty enforcement, every unnecessary reprimand. And then one day, leadership noticed a drop in productivity. It wasn't huge, just enough to raise questions. They called a meeting. Not with HR. Not yet. They called a group of employees, me included, to explain the slowdowns. I stayed calm, quiet, observing, listening. Others spoke, but I remained silent, letting the discussion unfold. When it came time to provide evidence, I handed over my folder, not with a dramatic flourish, not with emotion, just a quiet, neat stack of documents, screenshots, emails, spreadsheets. Everything HR had enforced unnecessarily, everything that had slowed down workflow, every petty rule enforced to the detriment of the team. The room was silent. HR's face changed. Slowly. They realized what had happened. Every overreach, every abuse of control had been recorded meticulously, and leadership could see it. Not just see it, but verify it. HR didn't get fired, not immediately, but the reassignment came. To a branch office far from the team they had micromanaged. A quieter role with fewer opportunities to dominate, and suddenly the office breathed again. The tension lifted. Meetings were productive again. People smiled without fear. The petty rule enforcement disappeared. I didn't celebrate. Not openly. I went back to my desk and quietly continued my work. I didn't need recognition. The victory wasn't in applause. It was in balance restored, in the quiet realization that sometimes the rules themselves can become the weapon. I reflected on it often. HR had thought they controlled everything, but in the end, they were undone not by rage, not by confrontation, but by methodical preparation and careful observation. They had wielded fear as a tool, and I had wielded documentation. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that lasts. Watching the office return to normal, seeing my colleagues relieved, feeling a sense of justice restored without raising a voice. That was all the reward I needed. Sometimes I think about HR. I imagine them wondering how it all went wrong, how someone had quietly cataloged every overstep, every small abuse of power. And they never saw it coming because they were too busy believing their own authority was absolute. In the end, it wasn't chaos. It wasn't drama. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was patience, precision, calm, strategy, and it worked. Sometimes, the quietest actions leave the loudest impact.